Welcome, everybody. If you're coming in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're coming in from, what your Model UN background is. Panelists, if you want to do that as well. But we'll have you formally introduce yourselves in a little bit. But just so we know who's in the room, if you have MUN experience, where you're coming from, that'd be great. So for those who are here, feel free to type that into the chat, and that way we get a better sense of who's in the room for tonight. We're going to wait for a few more seconds just to get everyone trickling in. All right, so I am pretty excited to have this panel event on how the MUN community can help stop Asian hate. For those of you who you might have seen the actual hashtag Stop Asian Hate, it's one of many campaigns that are going out there. And it's really important that we address real world issues in Model UN and not just debate about them in Model UN, but actually try to debate about them and discuss them and understand them as citizens in this world. And so we're excited to host this panel tonight, to have this space, the safe space for us to talk about this issue, understand the different perspectives that might be out there, and understand what we can actually do and take action about this issue. So again, if you haven't done so already, please share in the chat your first name, where are you from, if you're in school, then what your grade level is, and also what are you hoping to get out of the event. This is going to be an event where we want to address any questions that you might have. And so if you have some questions, feel free to add that into the chat as well. We'll take a look at that in a bit, and hopefully we will answer some of those questions. All right, so before we get started with the actual panel, just a reminder on some Zoom etiquette. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to the chat as well, and our panelists are here to answer those questions. Please be respectful in the chat. We know this is a sensitive subject and there's different perspectives out there. There's a lot of misinformation online these days. So we want to be respectful in the chat. No spamming, no bullying or related behavior will be tolerated. And be ready to engage in this conversation. This is it's a conversation because we need everyone to be involved and understand what the issue is. And so feel free to add in your thoughts as well. So I'm your host for tonight. My name is Kevin Felix Chan. That makes my initials KFC. And I am the co-founder and CEO of Best Delegate Model United Nations. So I've been doing Model UN for a very long time now. Started doing Model UN in high school in Southern California, and eventually got into college and did Model UN at the college level at UCLA, served as their team captain, which is head delegate, and their secretary general for the college conference, and eventually served as Secretary General of a conference held at the United Nations headquarters, where I got to introduce then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And so that's my Model UN background. I love leading teams and working across teams, and that's what I did for my first job out of college as a manager in a large company. But eventually I had this passion for Model UN that I really wanted to share, and I decided to quit my job and start Best Delegate. And so I've been doing that for over a decade now, and we had a chance to teach in over 20 different countries, work with thousands of students around the world. And so I'm really glad to be here with all of you as part of this event. And just personally, I also grew up in an area that, in a neighborhood in Los Angeles that is heavily Asian American, and went to college that also had a high percentage of Asian Americans as well. So I've been very involved in Asian American organizations. I was actually part of 4 Asian American organizations in college. And then nowadays, I actually sit on the national board of the Asian Chamber of Commerce at the Next Gen, which is the millennial branch of the Asian Chamber of Commerce. So, getting to see how COVID-19 and racism has also been affecting business owners in the United States as well. So that's my background, but I'm here more as the host. We have some excellent panelists here that will introduce themselves in a bit, and we'd love to hear from them as well. But before we do that, just what to expect for tonight. So we'll start off with an overview of just what's happening in the world. What are the high-level events in the news that you may have heard of? And then we'll talk about a couple tips on just how to approach the issue, how to discuss global issues in general, including issues like this that might be sensitive and require understanding of how to engage diplomatically. And then we'll go on with our panel. So the MUN community, how the MUN community can stop Asian hate. We'll talk about things that are happening in the community, but we'll also talk about things that you can apply to your own school and to your Model UN club as well. And if you ever seen, racism, what do you do with it? How do you address it in Model UN? And then we'll also answer your questions. So that's what to expect for tonight. So major news headlines that you may have heard in just the past year/year and a half. So I think we all know that racism is not new, but a lot has happened in the news specifically around how this campaign, Stop Asian Hate campaign, grew in the past 2020 to 2021. And specifically, anti-Asian hate crimes rose by 150% in the United States during this time frame. And we're seeing increased xenophobia throughout during the COVID-19 pandemic, and as well as a tragic shooting in Atlanta in March. So a little bit more details about this is with COVID-19, a lot of, with COVID-19 and this origin stories of, and also misinformation of it coming from China, there was a lot of fear around Asians just even before COVID-19 hit America. And so there's a lot of, especially about how world leaders engaged and framed the issue, created a lot of xenophobia. So xenophobia is fear of people who are different than you, foreigners. And it created a lot of hate around the US, around people who were they the cause of COVID-19? There's all this information about this. And so that has been brewing underneath and fueled by different groups that are talking about this. And then in the past 2021, in the past few months, there's actually been a lot of hate crimes, including physical hate crimes. A lot of the instances happened in different Chinatowns, but across the US, there were a lot of documented cases, specifically assaults against elderly was a very common one. Against different business owners. And then of course, there was the tragic shooting that we all heard about in the news in Atlanta that culminated into a larger campaign that we needed to, Asian Americans need to speak out and have their voices represented. So that's kind of the background that's happening behind the scenes. And I know this is, it's very challenging to discuss some of these topics and what's happening because it's happening very subtly. Sometimes we don't experience it ourselves or we don't see it. Sometimes it might be microaggressions and we don't even know if we're not even sure if it's happening. So it's been challenging discussing these topics, especially if some people don't have the firsthand experience on these. So different ways to start a conversation if you're ever encountering this and you want to address this issue is a good question to ask is just to understand what have you heard about it? What have you heard about this news story? What are different perspectives about it? What will you remember most about this, right? Why is this important to us? How do you feel about it? So we all process our emotions differently as we encounter these issues, depending on who we are and how we're connected to it. So how do we feel about this issue and this event? And then what's the questions that we have? What are the biggest questions that we have about this? So these are great questions to open up a conversation and whenever you are trying to address something that's very sensitive. And I think the key is seek to understand before you're understood, right? Understand what the issue is, what are different perspectives, how people are experiencing it, how they feel about it, and how are they addressing it. And I think opening that conversation diplomatically is one of the most diplomatic ways to engage in this type of issue. So we'll talk about the panel now. This is about, again, how the MUN community specifically can help stop Asian hate. And I would love to have our panelists introduce themselves. So we have 3 panelists for tonight, Elaine Yao, Erin Lee, and Natalie. And I'll have each one introduce themselves in this order. So Elaine, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elaine. I am currently a high school math and science teacher in Brooklyn, New York. I have been teaching with Teach for America for the past 2 years. Eventually, I do want to go to law school, but I also am really passionate about education. So that's just where I am right now. I graduated from UCLA in 2019, go Bruins, and I studied political science and public health. And with Best Delegate, I have worked on a bunch of projects. I was a MUN mentor. I worked at their summer Model UN Institute. I worked on a media team, kind of done a lot. But I've done Model UN for 4 years in high school, 4 years in college, and now at my high school that I teach at, I am the Model UN club advisor. So this darned club has followed me through a lot of years now.
Awesome. Thank you, Elaine. All right, Erin.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Erin Lee. I'm a rising senior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So if you're familiar with men's basketball, go Tar Heels, anything like that, I am really passionate about Model UN. I've been doing it since I was a sophomore in high school. I started our high school club because I felt like there was a real need for an opportunity to talk about like IR and a lot of like these issues that affect students today. And at UNC, I've been involved in our International Relations Association behind conference planning, like chairing. I've also worked for Best Delegates since last June for the virtual Model UN Institute conferences and a couple of other events here and there. So I'm really excited to see what this company has done and continues to do. In terms of Asian American advancement at college, I am in an Asian American sorority. I'm also involved in like some other Asian interest organizations that I felt have really allowed me to verbalize a lot of the violence that has been happening over the past year. It's allowed me to make sense of a lot of social justice issues. And so being on this panel, what I really want to do is like to encourage you all to think about these things as well and take that back to your own schools and communities.
Awesome. I love that experience, and we can't wait to hear you share about those. All right, and we have Natalie as well.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Natalie, and as it says on the slide, I'm from California, and I'm currently a freshman in high school, and I've been doing Model UN since 6th grade, which is pretty early, but I didn't go to my first conference until 7th grade. And that was also when I was first introduced to Best Delegate through their summer institute, which is very fun, and I just can't get away from them. They've latched on to me, and I'm still here. So I'm excited for this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And I love also just this is a community issue. It impacts all of us, whether we're in high school, college, and beyond. So I love the different representation here as well on the panel. And so just to get started, before we get into the specific issues, I want to understand from the panelists' own experience, how have you seen or even experienced or observed Asian hate or racism this past year with the backdrop of everything that's been happening? Has this issue have you been personally affected by this type of issue? Or have you seen it affect others who you know in the communities that you are in? So anyone would like to start off with that, and just so we can get an understanding of like, this is a real issue that is affecting everyday lives.
Sure, that's a good question, Kevin. I'd love to get started. I think the first thing to really acknowledge and remember is that hate, racism, and hate crimes, like you said, Kevin, are not new at all. And the xenophobia surrounding our country has been very present and prevalent since its conception. But of course, COVID and everything that happened in the news just brought out and made more external these issues that were always brewing underneath. I tell this story a lot. I still remember this, but last February, so it was February 2020, I was on the bus. It was before COVID, I guess, had really become a heavy issue in the US, but I was on the bus, I coughed, and this lady started screaming at me about how I brought the Chinese virus into the United States, how I'm going to kill everyone in America. And I was like, hold up, first of all, how do you even know I'm Chinese? I mean, I am, but like, whatever, like, you can't do that. But I had experienced microaggressions my whole life, but I think this was the first time that it happened with someone I like completely didn't know, as a complete stranger. So that was kind of a like shock to reality. And then when COVID like officially shut down the US, I received a lot of messages from family members through WeChat saying like, hey, please stay home, like please cover your face, like don't let people know that you look Asian American because you might get attacked. And that was just concerning to me, more because that was something that had to be said and sent out through social media. So those are two instances that I can like remember in my head. But like I said, you know, this is now externalized and is very public, but racism against the Asian American community has definitely existed long before 2020.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear those incidences, and thank you for sharing, Elaine. Erin, Natalie, anything else you would like to add on to this question?
Yeah, just one more thing to add. This isn't my personal experience, but I think it relates to all the panelists and also the attendees who are here, because as you remember, a while ago, 6 women were shot by someone in Georgia, and that got huge news attention for maybe a week or 2 max, like 1 or 2 news cycles, and then it was gone. And as you remember with George Floyd, I'm not saying that like we shouldn't pay attention to George Floyd. That's a story that definitely needs to keep being told. But he got a year of press, while these 6 women got like maybe a month after like the initial flare up. So I think that speaks to how, yeah, as Elaine said, the coronavirus and everything brought out how bad our xenophobia and hate towards Asian AAPI communities are. But at the same time, I think that occurrence and how it was quickly ignored and then somewhat suppressed also speaks to how it's still a problem, that even though we did get some attention from the news and some good attention, it in the end it ended up turning a little bit sour for me.
So there's that brewing sentiment is, I mean, just because it's not in the news doesn't mean it went away, right? And so that's good to know. Erin, is there anything else you would like to add to this?
Yeah, I think Natalie brought up a really good point about like the context in which this is all taking place. Like we've been seeing state-sponsored violence against like bodies and people of color for a very long time, and it's only within like the last 15 months or so that that attention has really escalated, at least for Asian Americans. And I think that's very interesting because the term Asian American itself is like a very fragmented identity. There's a lot of space within it. Some are more visible than others. So if you can think about like the famous like FOB, quote unquote, like rich international student stereotypes versus like the reality, which is that like a lot of these AAPI hate crimes are happening against like the elderly who maybe like don't speak English, who like aren't wealthy, things like that. So I think Elaine and Natalie both bring up great points, and that like when we conceptualize the term like Asian American and we're like thinking about who this like violence is affecting, like it's good to be critical of that.
Yeah, it affects a lot of people. I think, thank you for sharing all your stories, because that also prompted me to also want to share one story too that I thought of, which is in my parents' hometown, in it's a suburb of Los Angeles, there was a specific person who was like attacking Asian women. But this was because it's like in the suburb, is only reported in Chinese language news. It wasn't reported in mainstream news. So everyone knew about it in the neighborhood. And after the 3rd incident, they finally caught the guy. He was, waiting in parking lots to like attack Asian women. But what that resulted in is my parents actually calling me and saying, don't go outside. It's not safe for Asians to go outside. And so imagine, that's the environment that we're being told, like, don't go outside, right? And or else people might attack you randomly on the street. And that's kind of like the fear that is like, brewing in the Asian community, or at least in the community that my parents are in. So I did get a good question in the pre-submitted questions just to understand the issue better. Someone named Tristan submitted a question that asked, what do we think is the main source or reason behind Asian hate? I know Elaine also mentioned this has been around for a long time as well, but what's the sources or reasons? Can we try to understand the issue? This is like almost understanding like the background of the issue because it's very complex. So what do we think is the main sources or reasons behind Asian hate?
I'll take a stab at that. First of all, I'm going to preface this by saying that I think there are probably a lot of causes, some more major and some more minor, but in the end, they all contributed to Asian hate. But I guess the one that I'll point out is probably nationalism, because Europe and Asia are not actually continents on their own. And I think that Europe was made a continent to create the idea of Europe and within itself national identities. And when you try to do that, you of course have to define who is in the nation, who do we protect, and who is outside of the nation, like who are we trying to defend against, who's the enemy, the bad guy. And that became Asia. So when you make someone the other as separate from yourself or the us, you end up demonizing the other. You end up having a lot of propaganda that's entirely false, a lot of slander. But as that keeps happening, it becomes normalized. And I think that happened a lot with Europe and Asia because of the conflicts between China. And then, of course, since America now has grown out from Europe, technically, that got translated over to America. So I think that's one of the causes behind it.
That nationalism. Okay. Aaron, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I think Tristan has asked a question that whole dissertations could be written on, but as Natalie did, I will also try to attempt to answer the question. So in taking some Asian American history classes at UNC, which I've been very grateful for, they're extremely hard to find at universities in the South. A lot of what is discussed is like how Chinatowns and like a lot of these like physical enclaves for Asian people in America from the very beginning were always like super hyper visible, always under a lot of scrutiny from like municipalities and the federal and state governments. So thinking about like where a lot of these hate crimes are happening, like a lot of them are happening in these like very highly populated like Asian areas, such as like Atlanta, like the Northeast, California, when I can pretty confidently say that like living in North Carolina my entire life, like you might expect it to be like really racist, but I personally have never experienced like a true racist incident in like the same way that Elaine was describing. And so I think this sort of scrutiny on like these areas and like these organizations that are created to fill this need, such as like Stop AAPI Hate, where you can like report a racist incident because the federal government doesn't keep track of like anti-Asian hate crimes. Welcome to Chinatown, which is like a local organization in like New York City. There's a lot of this like responsibility that is being borne onto the community rather than the perpetuator. And I think as like KFC, you were mentioning that these crimes, they're reported in Chinese, they're reported like in the local community. And so it's extremely difficult to try to talk about like anti-Asian hate with someone who's not Asian or maybe isn't familiar with these issues, because it's not being spread around. It's not like a daily topic of conversation, maybe the way that other social movements are. And I don't think that that's anyone's like fault, but I do think that it allows for like the continuation of crimes to be perpetuated. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Elaine.
I mean, I guess the short answer to that question is just colonialism and racism. Like if we really throw it back to the 1700s, race didn't exist back then, right? It really only began, the labels only really began after the slave trade began occurring, after anti-Blackness took hold and spread throughout the world. And within the US, a lot of the sentiment against Asian American people and AAPI people is born from the idea of foreignization, that that all Asian American, all AAPI folks are immigrants, that they have never belonged here, or they can never belong here. That was, I mean, there are all sorts of laws that came in, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, that literally prevented people from immigrating here who were of Asian or Pacific Islander descent. And those laws weren't removed until honestly pretty recently. So within the states, this idea of like foreignization has been present for a long time, which contributes to the racism that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders face. I even hate saying that because that's a really big umbrella term, and you know, within the Asian American community, there's so many disparities within the Pacific Islander community, like they're not all the same. But all that's to say, like that huge grouping, the like vacuous group of people that today we know as Asian, was created out of needing a label for all these people, was needing a race to describe these like different cultures and beautiful people as, and like all that does really stem from colonialism and anti-Blackness. And alongside that, sorry, I'm like stepping on my soapbox, I'll get off soon, but I think the reason why a lot of these issues are covered up is due to the model minority myth that was created through media, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, which kind of showed Asian Americans as like the people you want to aspire to be. Like they're all rich, they're all fair-skinned, they're all super smart, good at math. And that myth has really hurt all types of people of color, because it started pitting these groups against each other when really we face not the same, but similar forms of oppression in different ways in the States. And I think that also was one of the reasons why like this externalized hate was a shock to some people. Like people really didn't realize Asian American groups had experienced this racism for all these years because it was covered up by the shiny idea of like, oh, you want to aspire to be like an Asian person, but they'll never be white. And this idea has really been harmful to the Asian American community and to other communities of color. Yeah, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you for sharing all that. That's there's a lot of good information that all three shared, right? And you know what they're all pointing out to is this issue is deep and it has a lot of historical roots that maybe even spanned outside of the United States history as well. And a couple of things that they mentioned I thought were very notable to learn, because I only learned about some of these because I also took college Asian American history classes, or only even recently watching the PBS documentary Asian Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which Elaine mentioned, is the only law in the United States that specifies a ban on a specific ethnic group ever that's been passed in the US. And Chinatowns that Aaron has mentioned, that they were formed, that they were where people of Chinese descent were living, and the people in San Francisco did not actually want them to be living there, and they wanted to get rid of it because they thought they stereotyped it as dirty and where that sort of bad activity would happen. And so what they actually did was turned it into a cultural destination with the pagoda, which is not really like authentically Chinese, but they turned it with the pagoda so that like tourists would actually want to visit it and preserve it as a cultural institution, and that was their way to survive and keep the their place there. So it's been happening for a long time in U.S. history as well. I know, like we had Japanese internment during World War II, and so forth. So when we dig into the actual history, there's been a lot. This is not new, I think, as everyone kind of mentioned. So we talked about community and building community as well, and also the definition of AAPI community is also very new. We got a great question from Anushka, who's actually a student with one of our MUN teams. And Anushka asked, what can we do to help our communities struggling with anti-Asian hate crimes? So what are some actions that we can take to help our communities that are struggling with anti-Asian hate crimes? And and open it up to the panel for your ideas.
I mean, I guess as one of the newer one of the younger people here, I would say that the media is a lot more powerful than you think. So there are more ways to support your Asian communities in light of these like increased hate crimes, but one of them would probably be to like use social media. You as a student are probably the one who actually knows how to use it, so use it. It's a very, very, very powerful tool. I've seen it used in amazing ways. Also, like support the Asian produced or Asian actors. There was like Crazy Rich Asians. There was Raya and the Last Dragon, which is actually really good. I would still be saying that even if it wasn't an Asian cast, but it is very good. So go watch it. So yeah, support that kind of stuff. Like support Asian businesses. Use social media again. Yeah, just use the tools that you have and that you know to advocate for AAPI communities. And finally, if you see someone being racist, or if you see someone else or you yourself receive racist comments, speak up, don't stay silent, because staying silent is partly the reason why we got here and why we keep saying this issue isn't talked about, is because we don't talk about it.
Wow, Natalie, those are three amazing takeaways there. One, use social media to speak bring your voice out, represent, right? If mainstream media is not going to show it, let's do it on social media. Two, support Asian produced. You mentioned Asian produced like movies and other like forms of artwork. That's awesome. And businesses. And three is take action when you see these. That's amazing. Three very concrete things you can do. Okay, Erin, I saw you also unmute, so you want to build on that?
Yeah, but first I want to commend Natalie. You said you're a ninth grader. I'm really impressed right now. Definitely could not talk about AAPI like activism the same way you can right now when I was younger. But in terms of like what we can do as like communities is really just like talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, talk to your elders, and like people who you know that are not just your age. I think that there's like this huge stereotype that like all Asian Americans have like bad relationships with their parents, which first of all is like really, really disheartening to hear, and also like untrue. And if you just have these like conversations with the adults in your life, just being able to like talk about activism, to introduce concepts to them. A lot of people aren't growing up in like the internet age where they have this easy access to like quote unquote like activist language. Like they maybe don't have like action items in mind that we are like growing up with, as Natalie just so easily like rattled off. Like it might be harder for them to like become engaged in activism, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to have those conversations in the first place. And second, I do want to echo Natalie's point on supporting like small Asian businesses, like supporting Asian goods. My dad is a small business owner. It's been really, really hard over the pandemic to stay open, to maintain the same level of like service that's going on. Business has been really affected because China shut down their factories, like where are a lot of people getting their stuff that they're selling in stores? It's from China. So there's a huge manufacturing backlog. And so just going to like these locally like Asian owned businesses, and then also being patient once you're there and like understanding if like maybe they don't have some things, or like if they're really like critically understaffed, as a lot of other businesses are right now. COVID-19 and like this whole rise in hate crimes has really been a double whammy to a lot of businesses. And so anything that we as an individual consumer to do to help alleviate that, I think is really helpful.
That's awesome. Thank you, Erin, for sharing that. Elaine, was there anything you want to add to this one?
I know this is a cliche thing to say, but I think educating yourself and educating others is one of the best ways to spread awareness and to ensure that these histories that were covered up are talked about. Erin and Kevin mentioned Asian American history classes. I too took one in college and it was really life-changing. But specifically, I think what isn't highlighted enough within our education is the solidarities that different communities of color have taken over like the time that the US has been in existence. A lot of times we talk about issues that communities of color face in isolation. I think learning about solidarity is super important because there are a lot of times in the past where people think and talk about communities of color as being pitted against each other in order to keep us separate, in order to keep communities of colors weak so that activism can stay like isolated, when really the solidarity has been really, really strong in the past. Like if you look at the Black Panthers and how different Asian communities supported the Black Panthers in their fight for liberation. If you look at how Bengali farmers in the past and Mexican farmers work together to advocate for their rights. None of these things are talked about really because if they were, then a strong people of color group and organization in the US would really threaten the status quo and white supremacy. I think taking initiative, actively searching for these stories and educating yourself on those stories is a great way to show yourself that this isn't new, like I said, and to know like what you can do in the future to advocate for and bring out those stories.
Elaine, thanks for bringing that up. I'm gonna build on Elaine's point and go a second round on that in a bit, because Aaron, I also saw you unmute. But before I do that, I want to just third Aaron and Natalie's suggestion on supporting Asian businesses, and specifically, I want to add on like support Asian restaurants. There's a, I'm part of the Asian Chamber of Commerce, and like the most visible frontline thing that anyone can see is like usually an Asian restaurant, and that's Asian businesses. And there's an Instagram I saw, an Instagram post where it's like, why do people love Asian food but hate Asians, right? And the opposite of hate is love. And so can we learn about the community through food, through going to these restaurants, and through supporting their businesses? And I think that's a really powerful way. So thank you, Natalie and Aaron, for bringing that up. And then Elaine, thank you for segueing into something else I wanted to ask about, which is a lot of, I also heard this too, which is in the AAPI community, which is also really new, it tends to stick together more than other ethnic groups. And I was on a panel where Daniel Day Kim, the actor, was speaking, and he purposely brought on non-Asians into a Stop Asian Hate panel. And he was like, we need to learn we need to build allies, allyship. And he recognized, a lot of the other panelists shared, they come from like either the Black community or Latino Latinx community. They have been like engaging with each other, and so when they need help, the allies work together. But the Asian American community, relative to those other groups, at least from what was shared on this panel, has not historically engaged as much and built allyship. But I think, Elaine, you're describing that's happening. So this relates to a question that a student also asked, a student named Jonah asked, what can I do as a student to promote awareness around this issue? So maybe like to the broader community, to those outside the AAPI community, how can I promote this awareness about this issue so that others learn about it who may not even be aware about the issue? So Aaron, I'm gonna have you go first because you might have a previous thought that you want to build on as well.
Oh, well, now I'm panicking. But I think earlier what I was going to say was basically like this allyship is like really important. And it's also important that as like students, we don't undermine our own work. Like we're not like, oh, I'm just a high school student, or I'm like just a college student. Some of the most important like activists in America have gotten their start on like a high school or a college campus. Like you can look at the Third World Liberation Front at Berkeley. There's just like a lot of amazing history there of like student activism. But in response to KFC's question about solidarity, I think that this is an issue that really you have to take personal initiative for. It's about not just like messaging the easy contacts to work together for like a workshop or a meeting. It's like maybe cold calling someone or like DMing someone on Instagram and being like, hey, like, I think we have similar values, like we could work together. It's about doing things like at Model UN conferences where you maybe spend a couple minutes just acknowledging like the state of the world or like the state of what's going on in like the news. But I think those little things like might not mean a lot at first, but over time, that consistency can lead to something much greater. You can have like people reaching out to you and have questions like, oh, you know, I've never heard of this before, but like you bringing this up at like XYZ thing, like made me really curious. I've personally had those interactions, and like then being able to have that conversation with someone is really enlightening, like not just for the other person, but also for you, because you're not stepping into that role of like automatic educator, but as a like as a not as a coworker, but as a peer. And I think that's really cool.
That is a great way, just taking that initiative, but doing it in a way that doesn't like feel, you know, like it feels safe, right? It's just they're seeing you as you as a person. So thank you for sharing that, Aaron. Elaine or Natalie, any other thoughts about creating awareness about the issue or building allyship? Or solidarity? Yeah, Natalie?
Yeah, so this is more applicable if you're a student, but I guess if you're a parent too, it could work, because if you have a child, assuming you have a child that goes to school, I've seen my school actually implement anti-racism into our curriculum, and they're really actively trying this year to do that. We have these things called affinity groups, which are essentially groups that you can sign up for depending on your ethnicity and how you identify. And this year they added a new one called the anti-racism affinity group, and I thought that was really awesome. And I think that because if you're in a school, that automatically reaches out to likely hundreds of students. So that's a really great, and not necessarily easy, because you're going to have to, of course, set up the group, but it's a really great way to quickly reach a lot of people and also make sure that they listen, because at school, you have to pay attention. So I think school definitely is actually a pretty good way to promote awareness. So like talk to your teachers about it, talk to your friends about it. If you got support, if you want to do this, like talk to your principal, keep pushing for it.
That's amazing. That's the first time I've heard of anti-racism as a club, and that's powerful. That brings together by default so many people, so many allies. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that idea. Elaine, if you have anything.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about my own journey into like, I guess, trying to work toward being an activist. Like I'm nowhere near perfect. It's been a long time since I like started learning about the racist systems in the US. And I still have a lot to learn. I think in regards to the question on allyship and building allyship, something important to remember is to listen, and to do and participate in activism because you care about it, not to get anything in return. Like I've seen some posts on social media that were pretty toxic, that basically were like, oh, well, we saw all this energy for this movement. Where's the energy for this movement? And I think that's a dangerous and a slippery slope, because that in the same way pits communities of color against each other, when really we should be supporting different communities of color, because what they face, the oppression they face, is unjust, right? There shouldn't be like a receiving end to that. So I think constantly reflecting and checking ourselves as we participate in activism is really important, because we don't want to fall into that trap of like demanding something in return, because that also puts undue burden on the grassroots activists and the voices of color that are just trying to fight for what's right and do what's right. So on the topic of allyship, I think that's just something that I wanted to highlight for us to always be remembering and checking and stopping ourselves as we continue to do this work. I don't think I have anything to add otherwise. Aaron and Natalie said it perfectly.
Elaine, what you described is really important in the grander scheme. I've heard this phrase before where like, we're not trying to play oppression Olympics here and see which one's having it worse, right? We have to support each other in different ways, even if the issues are not going to be the same, but we have to support each other nevertheless. And Elaine, I'm glad you reflected on your journey because it's helping me reflect on my own journey too, and finding that voice, because the allyship work, there's a whole spectrum. Not everyone has to be out there protesting. Not everyone has to be out there writing letters to Congress. Everyone has their own way of approaching the issue, and depending on what you're comfortable with, some people are trying to break the system, and then other people are trying to change within the system. So these are very two classic spectrum to approach any movement, and then you always need somebody who's in the room and someone who's out in the streets. Kind of reminds me of Model UN Unmod, right? You need somebody who's in the room and somebody who's out in the room, So, for me, I'm one of the person who's works within the system, and I know other business owners, I know other people, and I try to, I'm hosting this panel for Model UNers, and so that's what I'm comfortable with. And so just for everyone who's out there and you're trying to get involved, figure out what works for you, right? What you're comfortable with, how you want to engage. Okay. Probably one of the last questions, but it's definitely most relevant. Aaron also brought this up earlier, which is specifically to Model UN, since we're all here as Model UN participants. What forms of racism have you seen or observed or heard about that taken place within the Model UN world, and what actions can be taken to address some of these incidences in Model UN specifically? This is from Parvasha, a question that was submitted in advance. So, and if any of the attendees have other questions, feel free to drop them in and we'll see if we can get them before the end of the hour. But Model UN specifically, if anyone can think back to your experiences, or just in general, when we're dealing with Model UN, because a lot happens in Model UN. What forms of racism, or maybe if it's not racism, but something else that this is adjacent to it, and what actions can be taken against this. Would anyone like to try to take a stab at that question first?
Yeah, I can go. I think traditionally Model UN is seen as a boys club, but even more so, I think it can be seen as a white boys club. Throughout my 8 years in Model UN, I saw very few people of color competing in on the circuit, and there was an especially noticeable lack of Black and Brown people who were in Model UN spaces. And I think that comes from a lot of reasons. One of them being that conferences are expensive, and having a club in and of itself in school is kind of expensive. And to be able to afford to go to those conferences, to be able to afford to know what the UN is and to create that kind of club in your school, those are all privileges that that we don't necessarily think about in everyday life. And all those privileges compound, right? So if you have a high school club, you're more likely to join in college, and to know about the UN in college. If you attend a bigger university, you'll probably have more funding to go to conferences. But all that's to say, I think to address that issue, the first step, of course, is to name it and to reflect on, as a club, our club's own anti-Blackness and and racism, and how we perpetuate that unknowingly. And then secondly, to see what steps we can take to break that cycle. So maybe it's, flyering, or trying to share Model UN more with communities of color within college or within high school. Maybe it's to make conferences more accessible and affordable. So something that really excited me about online conferences was that they got a lot more affordable, right? I was able to bring a lot more of my students to conferences because our school could afford to pay for all of our kids because it costs so much less money to do it online. Now, is that removing an aspect of social interaction? Absolutely. I don't have the answer. But I think one thing that came out of quarantine that I personally was excited about was seeing how much more accessible Model UN became to people who may not have participated otherwise. So to address the racism, I think this is one solution. And also to consider the intersectionality of the issues. So what are the oppressions that someone faces in school as a woman, as someone who may be disabled or part of the LGBTQ community? How does that also combine with their race, and how do all of these oppressions compound to maybe make Model UN unaccessible? Like really thinking deeply about and addressing these topics will help us see like how we can fix them as well.
Thank you, Elaine, for sharing that, and also the opportunities as well that it presents, virtual, online conferences present. Erin or Natalie, anything you'd like to add to this? Okay, Erin, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Elaine brings up a great point about like what is really insidious about the inequities in Model UN is that a lot of it happens before you get to the conference. And I think Elaine names that well. And I think that there's sort of two ways to approach it. One is sort of from the conference, like planning side, and another one is from the delegate. So I'm going to start from like the delegate side. And so as a delegate, especially as like a high school delegate, it's sort of inevitable that you will see or perpetuate microaggressions, even if you don't realize it at a time. Saying that someone else's outfit is like really ugly or like unprofessional, or maybe they can't afford to like get new business formal. A good blazer can easily be over like $200. That's something that not a lot of people can afford to spend on a high schooler like weekend competition. Being able to recognize like that language in yourself and your own team, and then also to stop it from happening maybe like from other people in your block. So if there's like a white man who's like constantly cutting off like women of color in the block like from speaking, sort of being like, hey, like they were speaking, like let them finish and then you can say something. Little things like that really go a long way towards creating a more welcoming space. And then when away from the conferences, really analyzing the own environment of the team. Is it competitive? Does it have like one race, gender, like whatever over the others? Is it a space that other people view as being closed off to them? And if so, like why, and how can you correct those issues? And from the conference planning perspective, so a couple of delegates from my school actually created a social movement called Momentum, and it's basically to make Model UN a more equitable space. And they published a whole document on like 10 ways to make Model UN more equitable. And so I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat. But I think overall, it really goes to the point that if you are not alone in like suffering from these issues. This is like a national to international problem. And like there are different ways that like conferences can make Model UN a better space, and then also attract a different type of delegate. There are some conferences that are very famous for being like really exclusive, like really expensive, but again, like as Elaine was saying, public schools can't really afford to go to those conferences. Like students can't really afford to take off like time and then like pay thousands of dollars in plane tickets or hotels. Like, so attending local conferences, trying to maximize your opportunities when available, and trying to reconceptualize and reimagine what the future of Model UN can be. It's probably not going to be like just virtual, but that doesn't mean that we can't have virtual things. It's not going to be like just in person, but then when you do return it to in person, like what is that in person going to look like? How is it going to be different from Model UN in the past? So this is something I'm really passionate about, but I'm gonna stop being on my soapbox. So if you guys have any questions about Momentum or want to like chat about anything, I'm always here. So yeah.
Thank you, Erin. Natalie, go ahead.
Yeah, so Erin and Elaine already said a lot of what I was gonna say, but I guess my one thing to add is that as a delegate, first of all, I want to say that on my end, like I'm in an in a space and in an economic position to be able to attend many conferences. So in that respect, I'd like to say that like this is the position everyone should be in. Like no one should have to not attend a conference because they don't have as much economic privilege as I do. So first of all, there's that. And then also I want to add that as a student, when you get your country assignment, like be respectful towards the country pretty much. It doesn't just apply towards Asian countries, it applies to any country, no matter how much you've heard about how bad they are in the news or whatever. Like just take the time when you're doing your research to understand this country, understand why their policy is the way they are, and have empathy. And I think that's a really powerful way that Model UN itself can help, like doing Model UN itself can help contribute to anti-racism, because you have in order to represent your country well, you have to have empathy. You can't be biased against them because you're literally representing them. So in that sense, I would say like do your research very well and have respect as you're doing your research.
Wow. Okay. I think Aaron, Elaine, and Natalie just gave us a lot of like systematic structural inequities that we can take leadership positions on. I think Aaron's pointing out, you know, their group is already doing that, but everyone here has a chance to take on leadership to actually address this issue at a very deep level. And wow, that presents us as Model UNers, you know, it's not just about like talking about the issue, but like there's actual things about the activity itself that we can address. I want to throw on one more just to wrap up this. One more idea is what we think of as a best delegate and what norms is that formed around? Is it formed around, you know, somebody who's like very talkative and confident in a like Western media sense? Because I remember I was one of those shy and nervous delegates, but I also grew up in a culture that like don't speak up and don't like make a lot of noise. And I didn't know about that until my co-chair in college, we were chairing and we were deciding who to give awards to. And she brought this up because she herself was also Asian American. And she was like, you know, lamenting about how for herself, she just also grew up more shy, and that put her at a disadvantage for like what was a socially confident delegate that's presented on the circuit, right? So knowing those cultural norms as well for where you grow up, and also like what the society is showing in Model UN. So that's it. So thank you for sharing all that. That was really powerful. A lot of insight there, as well as a lot of things that we can actually do in our communities, in the AAPI communities, to build allyship and to address in Model UN. One more opportunity I want to share is I think it's important to talk about it in Model UN. And one of the topics that we do have at the Virtual Model UN Institute, which Natalie mentioned at the beginning of the program, is to discuss this racism and injustice. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of issues that are addressed at the Virtual MUN Institute this summer, racial justice being one of them. And so I think, you know, for those who want to engage and discuss these issues, there are opportunities starting this summer, and of course in the Model UN conferences that you go to when you go back to school. So with that, thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists. Again, I really appreciate all of you for sharing that insightful knowledge, also being very authentic and open, and giving this, you know, very valuable knowledge to the rest of the Model UN community. And this is being recorded, so this will be shared out to everyone as well. So thank you everyone else for attending and listening and being and taking this. I hope this was very valuable for all of you to bring back to your own communities, to your own schools, and go out there and make a difference, bring out the best in everyone in Model UN and in your communities and beyond. So thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone.